Here are our Week 7 fantasy starts and sits. So, a little bit of transparency on our Week 6 performance. We designated 30 quarterbacks as either start or sit, hit on 18 for 60%. Designated 57 running backs as start or sit, hit on 40 for 70%. Designated 73 wide receivers as start or sit, hit on 46 for 63%. And designated 31 tight ends as starter sit, hit on 18 for 58%. Tight ends was just a miserable week again. It's been really wacky, but overall we did very well for all of our starts and sits at every position. They were solid numbers. Some of our bigger hits: Ryan Tannehill, Kirk Cousins, Mayfield as a sit, Christian Kirk, Deebo Samuel, Cole Beasley, Chase Claypool, Myles Gaskin, DeAndre Swift, Adrian Peterson, and Austin Hooper. Some of our misses: Ryan Fitzpatrick, Matthew Stafford, Alexander Madison, Chase Edmonds, Laviska Shenault, Mecole Hardman, and Robert Tonyan. Here are some quarterbacks to start in Week 7. Joe Burrow is a good start this week. Cleveland has given up 20.2 points per game to quarterbacks. Burrow had 22 points last time versus Cleveland. I expect he has to pass a ton, and he has high upside. Stafford, he disappointed me last week, but Atlanta gives up points. Cousins had a good game last week, throwing several picks. I think that he could have a big week as Atlanta gives up almost 30 points per game to QBs. Start him. Ryan Tannehill, he's on fire. He's currently QB9 with one less game, averaging 22 fantasy points per game. Pittsburgh gives up 17 points per game, and we've seen quarterbacks be productive against them, so I'm going to start him. Big Ben is also a start in that game. QBs have scored 22 points per game against Tennessee. I expect a high-scoring game and a ton of points for the quarterbacks. Cam Newton, he had a bad week last week, and he still finished as a QB1. I expect the ceiling to be a little bit capped, as this is a difficult matchup, but he has a lot of rushing upside. San Francisco gives up 19.4 points per game to quarterbacks, and that rushing upside will help him, so start him. And Justin Herbert is a must-start. He had 7 touchdowns in 2 games prior to the bye. He's averaging 21.9 points per game in fantasy. Jacksonville gives up 20.7 points per game. I'm expecting a huge. Some quarterbacks to sit this week: Daniel Jones, he's just not producing. He's kind of droppable at this point. I would not start him. Baker, he's just not playable right now. I talked about last week, his ceiling is too low. Only about 15 points per game is his ceiling so far. I expect that they will run a lot this week, and I just don't trust this offense, so I'll sit him. Drew Brees is also a sit. Monitor Michael Thomas, of course. Carolina is giving up only 16.9 points per game to quarterbacks. Brees, he has played well recently, but against this matchup, and if Thomas misses the game, I just don't trust it. Derek Carr, he's also a sit for me. Tampa Bay, they looked amazing last week on defense. They give up only 14 points per game to quarterbacks. Tough matchup. I'm not trusting Carr this week. Rams, again, another tough matchup. They give up 18 points per game. Foles has not been terrific. He's been struggling here and there. He's been missing throws. I expect a defensive struggle this game, and I think points are going to be limited, so I will not start Foles. And also Drew Lock, he looked terrible last week. Completed less than 15% of his passes, threw some picks. Kansas City, they give up only 15 points per game to quarterbacks. He's a sit for me this week. Here are some running backs to start. Boston Scott, he's going to get a lot of touches with all these injuries. Giants, they give up 20 points per game to running backs. I think he'll have a quality start and should at least be a flex play. The Jets, they give up 23.3 points per game to running backs. Singletary, he's averaging about 15 touches a game. Should have a big week. Lat Murray is a start for me this week. He averages about 13 touches the last 3 games before the bye. Carolina, they give up 24.5 points per game to running backs. They're very good against the passing game, but not good against bigger running backs. I expect them to be used a lot and possibly get a touchdown. So as a flex, I would be comfortable starting him. Antonio Gibson and J.D. McKissic, both of these guys are starts for me this week, at least as flex plays. McKissic, he saw 39 snaps last week. Gibson saw 27. Both of them are getting on the field. Gibson is getting most of the work on the ground. 15th, he is in evaded tackles with 21, so he's very good on the ground. McKissic, he keeps getting work in the air. He saw 6 targets again last week. Both can be used as they're going to be both playable this week against a weaker defense. Swift, he exploded last week, finished as RB3. He had 2 touchdowns, 17 touches. He had a big week going up against Atlanta. I expect him to use the Detroit Lions, so use him a little bit more and more as the season goes on. So definitely start Swift this week. Here are some running backs to sit this week. Despite being torched last week on the ground, Buffalo, they've only given up 14.9 points per game to running backs. So I think it's a little bit of a misleading stat considering they only got really torched last week. It's the Jets. I don't trust them, so I'm not starting Frank Gore. Moss, he saw 5 touches last week. He could be a sneaky play, yet with such limited to go on so far this season, I'm going to sit him and then hope that potentially he does have a good game and we could talk about starting him in the future. Hasty, I'm not going to be starting him. He saw 15 snaps last week, 9 touches. I believe McKinnon will still be the guy. There's been a lot of talk about him this week. He's going up against a tough New England matchup as they give up only 14.8 points per game, so I'd sit him. Damian Harris, I think he's going to be a sit this week. San Francisco gives up only 12.8 points per game to running backs. Harris was out-touched by White last week. I don't think that he's going to be a big enough touched running back to start in this rotation. Malcolm Brown, he got out-touched again last week, 14-5. Bears, they give up only 16.9 points per game to running backs. I'm not going to be starting him this week, and I may not even start Henderson, but I'm still a little iffy on that. And then also, Philly, they've given up only 17.1 points per game to running backs, but I don't like this spot. Freeman has been getting touches, but he hasn't been efficient enough. Philly needs this game. I'm expecting a big defensive performance by them, so I'm not going to be starting Freeman this week. Here are some wide receivers to start. Fulgham, he's had targets of 13 and 10 the past 2 weeks. There's not many weapons right now. The Giants give up 25 points per game to wide receivers. You got to keep the hot hand and start them. I'm going to be starting Marvin Jones this week. Atlanta, he gives up 30.3 points per game to wide receivers. Jones, he saw 5 targets last week. He hasn't been doing much this year, but this is a great matchup. I expect a big performance. Same with Humphries. Pittsburgh, they give up 26.8 points per game to wide receivers. Humphries saw 6 targets last week. You got to throw against Pittsburgh, and with Corey Davis and Jonnu possibly missing the game, he'll get a ton of targets, so I'll start him this week. MVS is also a start. Houston, they give up 26.3 points per game to wide receivers. He saw 5 targets last week. The offense was out of sync, as you saw. I think that he could bounce back and have a quality day against an inferior opponent. Tim Patrick is also a start. He saw 7 and 8 targets in the last 2 games. It is kind of a difficult matchup, but we saw last week if they could throw, they'll throw to him, and he could get some quality catches and touches, so I'll be starting him due to volume. And then lastly, Christian Kirk, I talked about him last week, had a huge week touchdown-wise, 2 touchdowns. He didn't get many targets. They were up big. He saw 7 targets the previous week. Seattle, they give the most points up to wide receivers, so I'm going to start Kirk and hope for another huge week. Here are some wide receivers to sit. Darius Slayton is a sit for me. I'm not trusting the Giants, as you see the theme. Darius Slay could shadow him. Could be a tough matchup for him personally. I'd sit him for better options. Brandon Ayuk, he's also a sit for me. He only saw 3 targets last week. The Patriots have a good secondary despite a poor performance last week. I'll sit him in what I think will be a low-scoring contest. Jarvis Landry is another sit for me. Cleveland, I don't really know what to expect out of this offense. They got destroyed last week. I think they'll utilize the run a little bit more, like we saw them use against Cincinnati last time. He only sees an average of 5.5 targets. The Bengals secondary, they're kind of average. I don't trust this passing attack enough, though, to start him. I'll look at other options. John Brown, he's kind of been disappointing these past few weeks. He had that injury. He only had 4 targets last week. And although the Jets, they give up 20.5 points per game to wide receivers, that's 12th best. I'm not expecting much from Brown this week if he even plays, so I'll sit him this week. Michael Gallup, he's just too inconsistent. He saw only 6 targets last week compared to Lamb and Cooper, who saw 10. I don't trust his floor against Washington, who is 5th best with 17.2 points per game against wide receivers, so I'll sit him this week. Then also Emmanuel Sanders going up against a great secondary for fantasy. Carolina, they only give up 17.1 points per game. It's a tough matchup, and he could lose targets if Thomas comes back, so I'll be sitting him this week. Here are some tight ends to start. Austin Hooper, he's been on a roll these past 2 weeks. He's been tight end 7 for the past few weeks. Overall, he's been seeing the targets. Cincinnati gives up 10.4 points per game to tight ends. I'll start him again this week. Eric Ebron, I think, will be a start. Game script kind of worked against them last week. Tennessee, they give up 10.6 points per game to tight ends. It's going to be high scoring. I like Ebron to score and possibly finish as a top 12 tight end. Darren Fells, I'm going to monitor the injury report. With Atkins out, he has had a great 2 weeks these past 2 weeks. He finished as the tight end 2 for the past 2 weeks. He saw 7 targets last week, so I'll ride the hot hand and start him. Tonyan is another play for me, a bounce-back performance. Houston gives up 9.3 points per game to tight ends. I feel like he could score a touchdown as they got embarrassed last week, so I'll be starting him. Lastly, TJ Hockenson is a big start. It's a great matchup. Atlanta gives up 14 points per game to tight ends. I expect that they will have to throw again. This Detroit Lions team will have to throw a lot, so he will be a huge play for me this week. Here are some tight ends to sit. I'm sitting Ingram. He's only put up 10 points more than once this season. I just don't trust him enough to start him this week in a game that could get ugly. Carolina, they've given up only 5.7 points per game to tight ends. I don't like Cook this week. He's only seen 3 targets the past 2 games apiece, so I'll sit him this week. Arizona, they're giving up only 5.8 points per game to tight ends. This could be a higher scoring game, but I don't feel confident starting Olsen, who only saw 1 target the week before the bye. Gronk, he had a huge week last week, but Las Vegas, they're giving up only 6.4 points per game to tight ends. I think they'll shut him down, so I won't be starting him this week. And Hayden Hurst, he finally had a good week. Every time I start him, he busts. Every time I sit him, he has a big week. I think that this is a tough matchup for tight ends going against Detroit, who only gives up 4.3 points per game to tight ends. I do expect Atlanta to throw a lot, but to the guys on the outside. So personally, I'll be sitting Hayden Hurst this week. Here are some defenses to play. I like the Eagles versus the Giants, the Bills versus the Jets, the Chargers versus the Jaguars, the Bucks versus the Raiders, and the Rams versus Chicago. All of these seem to be favorable matchups. It could be a little difficult with the Chargers-Jacksonville game, but the Chargers coming off the bye, I could see their defense making a big play or two. If you guys have any more questions or comments, feel free to comment below or direct message me on Instagram at TheFootballTherapist. Also, check out my weekly rankings at TheFootballTherapist.com. Thank you again, and see you guys next week.